talk about teaching games. That's what this is about, right?
Yes.
How to teach games. Let's introduce ourselves.
Go for it.
I don't know you.
Oh, well, you can start it.
Oh, I'll introduce myself then. I'm James Ernest. I'm a game inventor. Have been making games, tabletop games, for almost 30 years, as we just established in the previous panel. And I teach games all the time. I think so we have a lot to talk about.
My name is Adrian Koester. I'm on the GameStorm committee. I am this year currently in charge of the game library. I'm a teacher by training. Haven't done that in quite some time for various reasons, but I do end up teaching games frequently at various events and meetups and such. So yeah.
Well, let's do an impromptu introduction and then take questions for the next 40 minutes. How about that?
Sounds good.
When I'm teaching a game for the first time, I usually try to start playing as soon as I can. And that means trying to get my players comfortable with not knowing what they're doing, because it is tempting to try to explain the entire rulebook before you start. The problem is, people can't really retain that. No matter how long or short the damn rulebook is, you need context for most of the rules in that book, and they don't make sense when you're starting from nothing. So when you demo a game at a convention, maybe you have 5 minutes. When you're trying to teach people how to play a game for reals, I think Power Grid actually says this in the rules, but for God's sake, play 20 minutes and then stop and start over again, because you'll learn more and you'll not want to finish that game. But onboard them through play and let them do the basic moves of the game, so that when you then explain the more detailed rules, they have some foundation to understand and remember those rules. Get them playing as soon as possible, play open-handed, do whatever it takes to get them in the swing of it, and then if necessary, start over and play for real.
Yeah.
That's so much more fun than on a lecture beforehand that lasts 20 minutes or longer.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you there. I take my teaching approach typically starts with the context, sort of the marketing splurges to what you're actually doing. You are in X world trying to do X thing, and then moving right to the goal. What are you trying to accomplish? And is the goal points? Is the goal money? Is the goal murdering all of your compatriots? Whatever you're working towards, because I found that context will suffice will sort of fill in and smooth out all the fiddly bits of the details that they will ultimately discover in those first few plays. And then beyond that, where I proceed from there really depends entirely on the game. Because the phrase that you used at the end of the previous panel, that don't think.
That wasn't me.
No, it wasn't that me.
That's okay.
Yeah, anyway, or that was used, I guess I should say. But anyway, I do try to get going as soon as possible, but I try to fill in as much explanation as possible, so where the rule book falls flat about making them think. So things like iconography. If I have a game board that is loaded with symbols that are not immediately intuitive, I try to give just enough explanation to have the symbols make sense, especially for things that are going to be important early in the game. And a good example is that, and this is sort of a game that's a bear to teach to new people, but things like Race for the Galaxy involves an enormous amount of symbols. There is no way you can teach that game without spending some time talking about translating symbols. But once you get past that, then you just dive in. But how much time you spend on that early in the game, just really varies. And as a teacher, that's part of the dance of figuring out how much time you have to spend and how much time you need to bounce around and backtrack.
What's your favorite game to teach?
A game where at the end of the night I win someone's money, and they
Besides poker.
and they decide they had a good time.
I find abstracts the easiest to teach, simply because you don't have the aforementioned symbology problem. Because you can give them the goal, you can give them the basic mechanic, and
Right.
things generally proceed very easily from there. The more layers of mechanics and story that you have built on in a game, much of which does absolutely enhance the experience, sometimes makes teasing out for the teacher, teasing out which pieces are most important, a little more difficult. Because like if your game involves combat, there's a combat sequence when certain events happen. Do you want to talk about that at the beginning, or do you just want to say, now we'll deal with that when it happens? Sometimes, because sometimes if you leave out those details, or leave out some of those details, when the players actually get there, they're like, oh, well, if I had known some of that, I would have done something totally different.
Yeah, it's tough to feel bad about missing a rule. No matter how many times you say a rule, someone's going to miss it.
Oh, yeah.
Right, the first time through. And then and they're not going to understand it or hear it until they have a context, until they've seen enough of the game that rule makes sense. You know, I got really good at teaching games when I was demoing them for other companies or my own, and what you learn over that time is there's a right order to teach rules in. That you can build a scaffold one piece at a time, and if you get the pieces in the right order, it's really seamless. But yeah, it is the first. If you don't know a game well enough, it's very easy to miss stuff, or it's very easy simply to not say things that you think are obvious because you've played it too much. All of this comes from doing that demo so many times that you learn the roadblocks. Like I've taught trick-taking games so many times, and yet I still forget to explain that trump isn't the only rule about which cards take cards, right? The lead card is higher than all the other ones on a given trick, even if it's not trump. So yes, it's so obvious that I forget to say it.
Yeah, I don't know how many times that I've tried to teach trick-taking games and forget that there's a significant chunk of the player population that doesn't even know what a trick-taking
Right. Well, there's
mechanic
also
is.
a non-zero number of players, no one in this room, of course, who will say, yes, I know what that is, and then you'll just jump right into phase B, and they look at you blankly, and you're like, okay, you actually don't know what that is, and you have to roll back to A.
Yeah.
But that's the true of any game style. If you say, do you know deck builders? Do you know worker placement games? Do you know Euro games in general? You can often bypass a lot of the teaching if the new game you're teaching has a lot of DNA in common with something they already know.
So what is the order for each game?
What I just told you. You
Yes.
can't learn for a particular game until you've done it a lot of times, right? I think if you want to actually prepare to teach someone a game, you need to understand what is most important in the structure of the game and try to put that out first. That how you win is a huge part of that scaffold, right? If I understand if points don't matter, why are you telling me about points? Oh, if points is how I win, yeah, tell me how I get those, right? But if I just say you get points by doing this, and I don't contextualize by that and say, and points is how you kill people, and killing people is how you get money, and money is how you get this other thing that's also called points, and points is how you win. I want to play that game, by the way. So I learned how to teach games when teaching Magic, and I watched people teach Magic badly by explaining the exceptions as if they were the rules. Because these people are fascinated by Magic, and Magic is just a rat's maze of exceptions, and they could go down this rabbit hole to the point that someone would think that one little thread was the whole game. If you find yourself doing that, learn not to do it. But like I would watch someone try to explain combat by saying, my creatures attack your creatures, and your creatures can block mine, unless someone plays fog, in which case, and then like talk for 5 minutes about a card that makes combat work differently. So for whatever game it is, it does take a little analysis on your part. You have to know it well enough to sort of know, this is the most important main thread, the main through line of this game. This is what everything else is hung on. I guess we could talk about a specific game and use it as an example maybe, but on that through line, you can now hang all of the other rules and understand that the secondary and third and fourth level, like which ones are kind of not important. And it's okay if you play a whole game and don't even know this rule. It'll only make sense to you after you've been all the way through.
Yeah. I mean, like a classic example, a very classic example, is teaching someone how to play chess. Can you teach someone and play in many games of chess and never have to explain the mechanics of castling? Yes. Should you? Absolutely.
Probably, yeah.
It's like, don't even bother going there with new players for the first few times. It's like, once they get familiar with it, then add those kinds of complexities in.
Yeah, castling and en passant and things like that are almost like the secret sauce of chess. Like you feel like a super genius when you finally learn those rules because they're this off the menu stuff that doesn't come with the basic game.
And it's like, and Magic is a great example because I've taught Magic relatively recently. I've been trying to get my boys to sort of graduate from Pokemon to Magic.
We all hope that for our kids.
But and I basically ignored in all the little fiddly bits and say, okay, this is what this color means. This is what these two numbers mean. This is what that status means. That's all we need to get started, and you stop there, and everything else you deal with as it comes up. Now, some games you can't get away with that because there's sort of a critical mass of those little fiddly things that you need to get started.
It's a medium-sized space, right? Magic is defined as an infinite space, so I can't possibly tell you all the rules. I have to tell you the core, and you have to understand that you're never going to learn all the rules.
Yeah.
But if there's just enough that you kind of need to know all of them, that's a trickier situation, right?
Yeah.
So Feast of Odin?
Now,
That not one I'm perfectly familiar with, but
Okay. Right.
But-
I was gonna say, explain how to do that one, because there's like,
well, there's this feast.
there's 20 different player placements. And
I'll give you a relatively complicated game that I've taught a lot, and that would be Scythe. So Scythe has a lot of stuff going on the board. There's a certain amount of asymmetry involved, which, by the way, asymmetric games is the bane of every game teacher's existence. They are always a pain, which is why you very rarely see people teaching them at cons, because yuck. I still love them, but God, I hate teaching them. But anyway, so you have a certain amount of asymmetry, so you have to explain that a little bit so they have an idea of how they're different. And then I explain the symbols, the basic icons, and the basic set of actions. And then obviously, as I said initially, I start with the goal. The goal is money. You're trying to get money, period. Everything else is to that end. And then they have an action board, and they select actions. I go through and say a real quick 3-second description of what each of the actions is, and then we dive in. Everything else, all the mechanics of combat, all the mechanics of the board actions, that we deal with as we go. And I very much try to dive into it, but I've had people sit down and play that game that want to skip all the preliminary stuff and just dive into it. And it's like, no. You will be frustrated by this if you try. Just bear with me for a little bit to get the basic preliminaries, and then we'll go. The more complex the game is, the more inevitable preliminaries you have to do. Some of my most frustrating game experiences were games where people told me nothing going in. I played at the top of that list. Someone taught me Seasons. and they told me nothing. They said, this is a drafting game. The first turn you're playing, you're drafting stuff in seasons. It's like, what am I trying to do?
Right.
How do I know what to pick? It's like, we'll figure that out. And it's like,
Well, then
I hate you.
Right, drafting can't possibly work if you don't know what you're drafting for, right?
Yeah, I ended up winning that game anyway, but by sheer luck.
But it was frustrating.
But it was damn
Right,
frustrating,
right.
and I haven't played it since.
The unfun victory.
Yeah, and it's,
I think one of the places you can look, obviously, is the order of the rule book. If it's a well-written rule book, it should be presenting the highest order information first. And if it's poorly written, you will know. But like, look to that and say, well, what do they mention first? They probably mention how to win. They probably mention the core piece types and whatever they think is the most important at the top of the rule book. And then they get into the special cards and the exceptions and the fact like later on. And you can kind of, okay, we'll get to the FAQ if someone actually A's one of these Qs, but otherwise I'm not going to talk about it.
yeah. No, if it's a well-written rule book is a very important caveat there, because there are some very badly written ones.
Like I said, you may be able to tell if it is badly organized.
Yeah, but one thing that I will mention that I think for people who are teaching games, especially at conventions like this, is make sure your game is set up before you start trying to teach. Because nothing loses players faster if you're trying to teach while you're setting up, because they're distracted. It'll muck things up faster than anything else. Obviously, in some cases, you don't have a choice, because there's been a number of times just during con already where somebody is sitting down at the table and they haul me aside and say, hey, can you teach us how to do this? And at which point I walk them through setup and do what I can. But if you're going into something knowing that you're going to teach a game, save yourself some trouble and make sure it's set up first.
It might also be possible, if you're demoing a game at a con, you only have 5 minutes, or if I don't know which game we're talking about, but there are some games where understanding the middle or the end of the game is really critical to knowing how to start. If you can set up a game that's halfway through and say, I'm going to show you a couple of turns when this game is actually cooking, before we set up and start over, that may be the best way to onboard them. They can't anticipate everything that's going to happen, but if you can show them a few turns, they'll have a whole bunch more structure to hang all the new rules on. I mean, in a trick-taking game, it's really easy, because I'll just put cards out in the middle and say, this card does this card does this, right? And that's very easy to set up, and that's what I'm doing. I'm jumping to the middle of the game. I'm saying this is how this happens, and then going back to the start and dealing the cards out. Good. So there's more complicated games that you would take 5 or 10 minutes to do that may well be worth it if you can set up that middle of the game and show what's really supposed to happen, as opposed to how it looks at the start, which is often just kind of a blank slate. Like, I think Seasons would probably benefit from that.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? If you said, this is the middle of the game of Seasons, this is what all the cards do. Now, pick the cards you want to use. Oh, well, now I know what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between teaching a game you yourself are going to play with them and teaching a game for other people?
In a way, yes. But it has less to do with the actual education of the game itself and more of how I approach the game as a player. Because if I'm playing and teaching, I will frequently call things out and say, watch out for this, or this is something you might want to consider as sort of a line of thinking or a line of strategy in this game. Good example, a game like viticulture, where your goal is making money and gaining points and making wine. And that is sort of the point. It's thematic. That's how most people win the game, by doing that wine production thing. I always tell players that just as a point of thinking, to kind of get their minds out of that box, that it is possible to win that game and not produce a drop of wine. and just to sort of open their brains to the possibilities and get them looking around at all the things that can be done. Because a lot of the things it's hard to do, especially when you have a game that has a lot of avenues towards points, is players can get tunnel visioned. and breaking players out of that. Or leaving them in that is usually problematic because they will inevitably get frustrated, especially if you have a mix between new players and experienced players at your table.
Something that makes a good family game, or a game that can be played by players of various skill levels easily, is open information. One of the many reasons Monopoly is a good game, fight me, is that there's no secret information in that game, which means that the experienced players can tell exactly what the new players have and advise them on what to do. Whereas if they had a bunch of secret information, they couldn't give such good advice unless they showed their hands. That being the case, if you really want to teach a new game, play open-handed.
Yep.
Play a few rounds where you can see everyone's cards and talk about the things they would do with that secret information. Let them tell you what strategies they're thinking of and so forth, but do it open-handed. Understand whenever you're teaching a new game that the point is not to find the winner. The first time someone plays a game, they shouldn't want to be the winner. And I know that everyone says when you demo a game to sell it, you have to lose to the guy who's playing. But I don't really believe that, because if you get all the way to the end of the game, you're demoing it wrong. What you want to do, the way you win a demo game, is that everyone walks away understanding the rules.
And possibly wanting to buy it.
Well, absolutely wanting to buy it, right? Understanding it, and therefore, because it is so awesome, wanting to buy it. But whatever the reason, if you can play your first game and understand how to play, that's much better than winding up at the very end of it and saying, oh, I see now. I'm not sure I want to play that again.
Yeah.
Which, as a side note, means that if you're choosing what game to teach, maybe a game with less secret information will be easier.
Yeah, and the secret information thing, that sort of, because I talked about how asymmetric games are so difficult to teach. That sort of leads into kind of another class that is very challenging to teach new players. Is any game that involves like secret betting, bidding, or negotiation.
Or bluffing.
Or bluffing.
Or deduction.
Anything like that, because it is impossible to do open hands or anything like that in a game where that is the central mechanic.
I think, though, like a good bluffing game probably has a really short repeat cycle, so you can play a lot of rounds of that game, and then you're into it, right? As opposed to a game that takes an hour. By the time you're done with that demo, that's all the time you have.
Yeah. So, like one example that comes to mind, and I don't remember who taught me this game, but whoever it was, they did it relatively well. Was a game like Scoville, where you're doing secret bidding for positions or peppers or whatever. I'm blanking on it right now, but I'm walking through a couple rounds of that, and then backing up and say, okay, now let's actually get started, because that's a core mechanic, it's a core thought process for getting them into the game.
I was just wondering if you have any tips or advice on how to learn to teach games better.
Play lots of games.
Teach lots of games.
And teach lots of games. I guess play lots of games with a large variety of people. Because one of the things that I learned very quickly is that in order to be an effective teacher, you have to have a certain amount of experience interacting with a lot of different personality types, a lot of different learner types, a lot of different people in general. There was a game meetup that I helped with when I was living overseas. That they had 50 to 80 people at this meetup twice a week.
I want to go overseas.
Unfortunately, that particular Japanese restaurant had to close because of rent issues. But yes, I miss that place.
Yeah.
The owner of said Japanese restaurant, by the way, this is a big digression, but is one of the people behind Campaign Coins.
Oh, okay.
Andre is a fantastic person. If you're looking for metal coins for RPGs or a series of games, look at their stuff. They're fantastic. They're wonderful people. Anywho, they had a wonderful variety of people coming to these meetups. And So I got very social people at my games, which are sometimes easy to teach, sometimes not. Very introverted people, which same problem. People that are like spectrum, which offer a whole series of unique challenges depending on the game. And I guess the point of all that is experience is everything with that. And you just have to teach a lot of games, teach a lot of variety of games, but know your own limits. If there's a particular class of game where, for whatever reason, it's not clicking, either for yourself or for the people around you, and it's possible it may not. You can practice more, but I've seen people get to the point where they decide how this game works in my head is clearly not how it is working for everybody else at the table in their head. And because those aren't lining up, we need to find sort of another avenue of explanation. It's a bad way of saying it, and I don't mean to have that sound discouraging, but it's something that I learned as a teacher a long time ago, that you do have to know what kinds of things that you are fundamentally good at, and you can get better at a lot of things, but sometimes there are limits, and it is to your benefit and to your players' benefit to kind of have a feel for what those are. Is that?
Yeah.
I think if you teach a lot of games, you'll learn to read the room, you'll learn, like you said, what player types you're dealing with, who is lagging behind because you're going too fast, and who is losing focus because you've said the same thing too many times. It's tough when the group is a mix of all those people, but you do it enough, you learn how to do it. And there's two kinds of people who say, I got it, and they're the people who got it and the people who don't. And you just got to figure out through experimentation whether they actually got it. But I think teaching games teaches you to understand the systems of games. Understanding the order to present material in helps you understand the material. Probably makes you a better game designer as well. If you can understand games well enough to explain them, you learn a little bit more about how they work.
Yeah, because frequently, when I've been involved with playtesting for games, one of the things that I have heard from those designers as valuable feedback is that this particular mechanic is a nightmare to teach, because some part of how it's either laid out in the rule book or the way it just functions is difficult to explain, and then the next iteration that comes out, the design is tweaked a little bit so that to make it flow a little easier. So if that's done properly at the playtest stage, then you usually don't run into that, but every once in a while you do.
Yeah, I have a background in poker, and so I wrote a game with a poker mechanic inside of it, which made a lot of sense to me, but it was impossible to explain to most players. There's so many more scaffolds that they need that I already had. I think if I remember correctly, the goal was not to have the worst hand, but to have not the best hand.
Have the most average hand.
Just you get punished if you have the best hand. So all you have to do is shoot under that, right? That was the idea, but it was pretty damn complicated, especially for people who were not used to just immediately reading a 5-card poker hand. Questions?
Games that you've tried to teach, games that you've successfully taught.
And don't be afraid to ask the same question twice, because we will give you a different answer.
Kind of a question. I tend to be the kind of person who likes more in-depth strategy, resource management, heavier games like Dune, Twilight Imperium's a big one for me. Those sort of games. How would one go about trying to teach that game or trying to make that game enjoyable, or at least understandable or comprehensible for someone who may not necessarily be into those kind of games, or someone who's very new to them?
First of all,
Is that a wash and forget?
make
or-
sure they can't leave. Restrain them in any way. It's necessary to keep them focused on your demonstration above all of their other needs. I don't know, I mean,
Meeting's over.
find out, try to figure out what about those games is the most interesting to you and sell them on that. You know, why is Dune so great? And I don't think it's really because it's so complicated, but it's because all of those details give you an experience that you can't get playing something else.
Yeah.
Right? And so yeah, sell them on that.
I think as you were talking earlier, especially with Twilight Imperium, that might be one where you show them a sample turn in the middle of the game that includes a vote, that includes a reward, but essentially they get the story of all the cool stuff that's going on in Twilight Imperium, and then you say, learning the game, you're kind of setting up your empire, but we'll get to that cool story we just saw as an example pretty soon.
I think it's also possible to give someone context with a really small sliver of the rules. It depends on the game, but a game like Cosmic Encounter has like, whatever, 60 or 70 different alien races, but if you show how 2 of them work, that teaches you most of the context, and that's half the game. And then, you know, when they get a new one, they have a context to sort of plug it into, but explaining all 60 is a waste of time.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and Cosmic Encounter is a good example of that, because you can, and it's similar to Magic in that sense, where you can go through.
They are similar.
Yes. Yeah, hush you.
Right.
But anyway, but you can spend a fair amount of time on the core mechanics, on those core back and forth battle mechanics, which nobody gets right the first time anyway. And then spend the rest of the playthrough of that learning game dealing with resolving the confusions about all of the asymmetry. And that's part of learning the game. Another thing with really deep, complicated games like Twilight Imperium and like Dune is to reassure players that little missteps early in the game, as they're figuring things out and getting their feet under them, are okay. Happens to everybody, happens to the best of players, and what happens early days is recoverable, is manageable. You are not going to dig yourself into an unrecoverable hole. There are games where that is possible. I tend not to play those games with new people. And again, I'm part of the as a teacher and as somebody who introduces people to games. And if somebody comes to me with a game in their hand saying, "This looks awesome, can you teach it?" I'll do my best. If someone comes and says, "Can you teach me a game?" And then we go through the whole discussion, well, what kind of game do you like? And after we spend the next 40 minutes discussing that, they'll say, okay, here's a game that I know how to teach well, that I think you'll enjoy. And point them in that direction.
I've sometimes found the hardest person to teach the game to is somebody who you start to teach it, and after a while they say, "I'm just not processing this, let's get started." And they really can't get started because they don't know enough of how to play. But
Well, you came in late, but we told you,
Yeah.
start the damn game. Just play, right? Play open-handed, get the game rolling, because you're right, they can't process it. They have no way to understand or remember all of these rules you're laying on unless they have some sort of framework. And yeah, get them going. Like they're right, I think, to have that instinct. And then you think, well, you won't play this correctly unless you know all the rules. You're damn right they won't. Like, that's not the point. The point of the first playthrough isn't to win or even to play right. It's to learn most of the rules or some of the rules, or learn as many of the rules as they can so they can play it again and again and actually like play it right. I think there's a lot of games where it seems like to me the whole point of the game is to learn the rules, and once you have, you're done playing. And I don't like games like that at all. Like, I like much simpler games as a general rule because I want to understand the rules and then spend the rest of my time digging into the strategy and figuring out actually how to win, not how to play. But yeah, for a more complicated game, you just gotta start going. You gotta get them playing it.
I'd say one of my favorite ways to teach games is teach it backwards. Because the next sentence out of your mouth answers the question that you just made the person answer in their head so they don't stew on it. But there's times when, maybe it is good to just go through the rule book in order, but just jump in. Like, we sat down for a game earlier today. None of us knew the game, knew the rules. We're like, okay, here's the goal. Started going through the example of a turn. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take my first turn now. I'll just go first. I'll do this as we read it. We'll see the turn as we read it out, and then we can continue.
Yeah, that's fine. I think the rule book will tell you what ideas the designer thinks are the most important. That's not necessarily the order to teach it in, but it tells you what's the most important ideas to get across. And I think a good rule book does tell you how you win right at the start. But if it doesn't, or if it leaves a lot to the imagination, yes, jump to the back and say, this is how you win, this is the other ways you win, these are the tiebreakers if it matters, and show on the table if possible, or up in the sky with words if necessary, all the players what they're trying to do, and then you can, everything else makes sense.
A lot of players, you start throwing game mechanics and rules and stuff at them. If you didn't start at the end, at least for a very small piece, they're going to be sitting there thinking, okay, but how do I win? How do I win? Then you get to the winning part.
Is that important? Is that important?
Okay, how do I get there?
Yeah.
And you're like, well, we just went over it.
I remember none of that.
And there are times, and this is where a lot of it comes to like reading the room, because like common mechanic out there in games, in deck building, for example. And if you can start out by teaching a new deck builder game, have you played Dominion? And if everybody at the game nods their head, says yes,
then you can say you already know all these rules.
then you can skip to the fiddly bits for the game, because you know all of the base mechanics for deck builders. You know the basic turn process because they're all the same. If you get a bunch of blank stares, and that's when you need to take a step back and says, okay, this is what a deck builder is, and this is how you build your cards. This is how you start, and that's part of reading your audience, which is one of those core skills that anyone who does any sort of presenting or teaching or training has to have.
Develops over time.
Yes.
Not has to have, but will develop over time.
Yep.
Not a prerequisite. It's just doing the work teaches you how to do the work. And when a game inventor has to sell a game to a publisher, he has to come up with an elevator pitch for it. He has to say, if I have only 3 seconds to get your attention, this is what I tell you about how this game works and what's it about. You kind of have to do that for the game you're trying to teach. It isn't just about explaining how you win, but it's explaining why the game is cool. So if people don't know what a deck builder is, you need to figure out for yourself what a deck builder is so that you can kind of start there. Everyone is going to be buying cards out of the middle and adding them to their own deck to try to make their deck better and worth more points, or however you think that elevator pitch goes. That's something you spend a few minutes thinking about before the demo starts, or learn after you've done the demo 20 times or whatever, but you get to that point.
For, helping publishers or just anyone in general, if it's something that you don't really know that's similar to, and you can't be like, oh, this is like Ascension, or this is like whatever, it's like, this is different than ones I know, like, what's the best way to sort of get?
Well, like I said, if you're confronting anyone with a game they're not familiar with at all,
and like mechanics,
figure out what the elevator pitch is. It may be the mechanics, it may not, but whatever is the anchor point that first helps them understand the next step. What's the starting point? Pick a game and let's figure out what the starting point is. Pick a game we all know.
Puerto Rico.
Does everyone know Puerto Rico?
Then
Right, pick an easier game that we all know.
Power Grid?
Oh my God! Someone pick a game for God's sake.
Magic, go first.
Splendor.
Splendor.
Wow.
Splendor is a good one.
Oh, okay. I can't help with that. I've only played Splendor once.
Yeah. So,
The object of Splendor.
Monopoly.
The object of Splendor is not to play again, and I'm winning. Do we all know Monopoly?
Yeah.
So, I said it in the last panel, I'll say it again, but Monopoly is great because it makes sense. Kids want to play it because they know what it's about. And you really can't argue with that. Like, we can nitpick the rules and say it's a terrible game, and it is from a certain perspective. But as a product, it's extremely successful because players know what they want, and that game has it. As soon as you know that you're trying to bankrupt everybody, you understand half of how that game works, and everything else is just filling in the blanks. That's a huge deal. And if Monopoly had a different theme, it would be harder to explain. That's one of the greatest examples of theme, being reinforced by game mechanics. So what is a Monopoly about? How do you get someone to play it besides saying, this is a terrible game, but it's all we have? You're trying to make a bunch of money and bankrupt everyone else. That's it. That's the starting volley in explaining that game.
or something like Splendor, you start out with, this is an engine builder. You are building up capabilities. You're starting small, and you're using those capabilities to get more capabilities, to build an engine, to start that boulder rolling down the hill, start that steamroller, start that engine, and build the things up. Because one of the things that frustrates my wife to no end with some of the games that I try to teach her is games that start really, really slow. She hates those. Unfortunately, those are a lot of the heavier, more complicated games that I like to play. And she likes them once they get going, but trying to explain is like, okay, these are the early turns, these are the things you need to get to the good stuff. You explain the good stuff to kind of keep their interest, but this is what you get, this is how you get there.
Why don't those games just start at the fun part?
Yeah.
Because you gotta start somewhere.
Right, I know.
Yeah,
You got to suffer, or else you can't really enjoy the end, right?
Gotta know the misery of being a child before you can enjoy the enjoyment of being an adult.
Well,
The misery of being an adult.
I
Don't
like,
get your hopes up.
Yeah, I think that was backwards. The enjoyment of
Oh,
being
right.
a child
Right.
before
No,
the
it's
misery
yeah.
of being
First, it's the misery of being a child, wishing you were a grown up, and then there's the misery of being a grown up, wishing you were still a child. It's really just misery all the way through.
That's fair.
But you get more resources anyway towards the end. Also, every move is much more expensive.
this is a bit of a caveat, but this one of the things when I was teaching, and I use this on games, I use this in some of the science classes that I taught, but the minute I heard out of anyone's mouth any variation of "that's not fair," I said, okay, we're going to stop here and say, okay, there are three premises that you need to understand to get through the rest of this excursion. First premise, life is not fair, deal. Second premise, the sooner you accept that, or the sooner you understand that and accept it, the happier you are going to be. Premise number 3 is if you think life is unfair now, wait until you grow up, it gets worse.
I think it was one of the owners that put out by Dr. Seuss, for example. Somebody wrote in the paper, "The pleasures of youth are nothing compared to the joys of adultery."
We use the word fair to mean two almost diametrically opposite things. In game design specifically, is a coin flip fair? From certain perspectives, yes. There are definitions of fair for which a coin flip is fair. We each have an equal chance to win. You win on heads, I win on tails. You will win exactly as many times as I do, and it is by that definition fair. That's what that word means. But is chess fair? Well, of course. Aside from the first player advantage, if we play 2 games of chess, each of us being white once, that's a fair game in the sense that nothing random happens in this game to screw up and keep the better player from winning more often. Those are the exact opposite definitions of fair. And so when you're doing game design and one of your players or one of your testers or one of your other designers says, this game needs to be more fair, you kind of need to stop them and say, okay, what direction do you want to pull it in, because there's two.
Yeah. I had exactly this discussion with a number of people, because there are one of my favorite relatively recently released games is Tapestry. There's a lot of people that can't stand Tapestry because they played one game. There was one person that won by 400 points, and the next, they just didn't like it. What I tried to explain to them is exactly that kind of thing. It's like, if you play a lot of different games of a lot of different instances of Tapestry, you will see both ends of that swing. You will see very close games, you will see very far games. So from a larger probabilistic sense, is it fair? Is it balanced? Yes. Does that mean every single instance of the game is going to be close and fair and balanced? No. Should it be? Probably not.
And in politics, they talk about it as a difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Right? The coin flip, or another way to say it is we always each get half a pie, is equivalent of outcome. Chess is equivalent of opportunity. You both had the same game board. It was up to you to decide what to do with it. Right? Neither of these is really fair in the life sense, but it is fair in the game design sense.
And that's one of the things that is difficult to for people who have that kind of fairness hang up is that when you're teaching them a new game, and because as we teach games, one of the things I think whether we do it consciously or not, we're trying to convince our players that this is a good game that's worth repeating.
Right. And one of the unspoken rules of that is fairness, and there are very few games that deliberately sidestep that. Can anyone think of? I have an example in my head. The Great Dalmoody from Wizards of the Coast, their marketing text on the box says this game is not fair. Like, that's just kind of part of the fun of that game is, yeah, well, I start off in the worst seat and I'm probably going to end up there again, but oh well, it's a silly little game and that's fine, right? Accepting that that's fine is part of enjoying that game.
But it's the idea that there are very few games that don't have an inherent bias towards players that think in the same way that the designer did, that inherently latch on to those same mechanics of how do you take best advantage of this sequence of steps. The best player is going to win. And if you do this kind of thing well, you're going to win. If you do this kind of thing badly, you're going to lose. And a lot of people see that as being an inherent problem with the game's design, and it's not. It just, some people latch on to certain designs and mechanics better than others, and that makes those of us in the position of teaching kind of a bit of a challenge. Because you don't want people to leave with bad taste in their mouth, but sometimes you can't avoid it.
Ice cream. Before the end of the game, give them all ice cream. And then they will leave with a delicious taste in their mouths, and they will associate that game with ice cream. I should have done that when I was trying to sell games at booths, you know.
I don't know, depending on
Free
the
ice cream Sunday for all who participate.
Have some candy.
Depending on the game, I don't want ice cream fingers anywhere near the game. It's good, or if you borrowed the game from somebody you don't like, just like feed them all Cheetos.
Yeah. Any more questions on the actual topic at hand? Okay, free Cheetos for everyone.
Yay.
Any questions off topic? We have a few minutes left.
What are some examples of bad games you've taught? Like, when you've taught them poorly?
I don't recall any mistakes that I've ever made. Honestly, like you kind of get better at it over time. So of course I was terrible when I started, but I don't have a specific
Or I guess
example.
just what, like, common missteps. you make, not
I honestly like rat holing. Like that's my biggest example from the early days of watching people teach Magic. Was falling into the trap of trying to over-explain some corner of the game because it's cool, but that completely distorts the listener's opinion of what's important about the game. You know, try to focus and be deliberate about focusing on those things that are most core to how the game works, instead of talking about how cool it is. That's a different problem. Like if you're standing at a game store and saying, you should buy this game because X, Y, and Z are cool about it, that's one kind of conversation. But if you're trying to literally teach someone the process of playing, that's a different conversation. Let's stick to how this is supposed to work, and let's talk about this exceptional rare card like later when you have the grounding to get how cool it is. So yeah, I mean, just the biggest mistake is falling prey to my childish likes about the corners of the game instead of just going straight through and explaining it.
The only other real misstep is assumptions. Making assumptions as to what you think your players know when in reality they don't.
Yeah, everyone brings a different language, and it's impossible to cover all cases, so you have to make some guesses that they know what shuffling means, and if they don't, you'll have to explain it, but like, yeah, you're always going to make a guess, and sometimes you're going to guess wrong. You don't know how to read 2 dice and add that total up. Okay, well, let's do that a little bit, and that's a big part of this game.
You've got to be able to get a feel of how they're taking it too. I mean,
Yeah.
explaining along and you suddenly realize they're not understanding why you're doing these things. You go back and say, okay, we're doing this because you get victory points from doing that.
Yeah. And we talk about that in terms of reading the room. Like if someone's glazing over, it could be because they think they already know it,
Yeah.
or because they don't understand a thing you're saying. And so, yeah, ask questions.
Either way, go back and
I think that's actually maybe something we should talk about is, this is not a one-way communication,
No.
right?
How do you
It-
check,
it-
in teaching
Yeah,
we call it
check
for
in often
understanding.
and get them to tell you what they're doing and how they're doing it and what they're hearing and you know, it's quite possible to watch someone sit in silence and know nothing about
be able to tell when they come in. This is a person who wants to know every step of everything I do. This person wants to know, how do I win and what do I do in the process to get there, and that sort of thing.
The hardest players to teach are the ones that are non-communicative. Very, very quiet players are very, very difficult to teach. And sometimes it's because they're just inherently quiet. They're not very outgoing people, at which point sometimes you have to use questioning to draw them out and see what they're thinking.
Teach games using the Socratic method. What do you think you would do first?
And in other cases, you have, especially when you have larger, like 5 or 6 player games, where you have possibly somewhat less outgoing players that are drowned out by the noisemaker, and who like inevitably starts dragging you down that rat hole, and that's part of
Yeah, I am always extremely brutal with learners who want to drag me down the rat hole, like more so than I even should be, but they'll be like, tell me how X and Y works, and I'm like, not yet. You don't get to know that yet. I have a plan for you, you don't get to know that yet.
patience, grasshopper.
Right.
It is hard to communicate, especially to get somebody you say, and you teach them and you can't do, and you ask them, you get that? And they say, oh yeah.
Right, oh yeah, that's what I said. People will say they get it whether or not they do.
And it's either, oh yeah, you're insulting me by asking me if I don't understand you, or it's, oh yeah, I didn't get it, but I want you to keep on teaching. And you don't know which.
Sometimes it's both.
Okay.
How much or what do you do when you're playing the game or they're playing the game? And like, some people you see they're getting, other people you can tell they don't get it, but they're just like, do this. Like they get enough to do the thing, but they're just sort of like, okay, I sat down, I guess I'll finish the game. Like how much do you step in and say, Miss N, what do you need to know?
I will not hesitate to take someone's turn for them if it's a demo game. And I think everyone's first game ought to be treated like a demo. Like, if you need help, I'm here to help you. You know, I'm not here to beat you. I'm not here to help like show you what a good player I am at this game you don't know. I want to help you do it. So if they're struggling, come around, look at their hand, help them do whatever, you know, ask them questions about what they're at. I usually only stop helping someone when they rudely refuse my help or clearly know what they're doing. But other than that, I'm taking everyone's turns for them. That's how you do, I think.
Yeah, there are times where you will get somebody who has sort of fallen into some sort of resignation that they're just sort of finishing the game to be polite, but don't really want to be there anymore. At which point, sometimes you just have to leave them be.
Because I do the same thing again and again because this is what I know how to do.
Yeah.
I'm not going to bother trying anything else.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, you just have to.
I'll just
have
make
to
wheat
know-
again.
Yeah. You can try to draw them out, you can try to get them re-engaged, but in a lot of cases that ship has sailed, and you just sort of have to cut your losses and try to get as much.
Terminate them, pull the switch, drop them through the floor.
Well, and focus on some of the other players that are more engaged and enjoying.
Do triage. They're gone. Forget it. Yeah.
Just to add to this, I'm still feel like I'm learning, of course, how to teach games. But something I always try to do, especially for people who are playing games that either they're new to or I know that they don't play games very often, is always saying, hey, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I will not take advantage of that. You know, this is all about learning. This is all about having fun. Just trying to kind of make sure that they do feel comfortable and safe to ask questions,
Yep.
and that they're not going to be stupid for doing that.
Yeah, I think that's, and maybe that's really important just to say up front, like, because we all assume that everyone knows it, but everyone doesn't know it, is that this is a learning game, we're going to play wrong, we're here to ask questions, and it doesn't matter who wins. Like, everyone needs to be on that page. If there is someone who's playing and, like, being hardcore about it, they're kind of the problem. Like, they actually need more help than everybody else, because they need to be taught that they're just in a learning game today.
Yeah. Which is another instance where trying to teach at con events like this can be more difficult, because you can run a scheduled game, and I don't care how many times you put in the description in the game schedule it says experienced players only. You're going to get a third of the table that has no idea what they're doing, and when you have very, very new players and very, very experienced players, particularly very, very experienced players who are impatient or are just not good at explaining the game themselves, having those two ends at the same table makes the job of the teacher that much harder.
I think this is a tough environment for experienced players only. I always invite players of all skill levels, and I make it clear that that's what we're going to do. Like, if I'm going to run like a big poker game for a lot of money, I make sure that novices are not only welcome, but encouraged to join. We are out of time on this. Is there any last questions we want to ask before we let you guys go? Well, thank you so much. I'll see you on the floor tomorrow playing games, and thanks for showing up.